Hi folks, today we're going to be talking about how to treat your API as a product. How do you productize and start monetizing your APIs and turn them into revenue centers for your company? A little bit about myself. I'm the CEO of Moesif, the leading API analytics and monetization platform. I love discussing API first strategy, growth, PLG, and little known fact, I love some IPA. So if you're ever in San Francisco, definitely hit me up. But why are we talking about this? For any product, there's always a product lifecycle that you need to plan and act on. So for our API is no different. At the very beginning here in these orange boxes, we have the business model, architecting what that business is and what the API is. And then we have some other things like measuring KPIs, growing and monetizing the product, and finally deciding whether you iterate or deprecate. Notice at the top here, these are all business concerns and product concerns. On the bottom, where we have engineering, that's where we actually build and serve the API itself. Today's topic is mostly going to be focused on the top boxes. How do you actually treat the API as a product? Let's go dive into the business model itself first. Each API business is quite different. So you have to start thinking about how do you meter usage? What are the value metrics that make sense in terms of customer value? How do you actually monetize and invoice customers? Is it prepaid billing? Is it postpaid billing? How do you figure out a tiered versus pay-as-you-go strategy? And when do you actually invoice? Let's talk about different business value metrics for different APIs. I have a couple listed here. One is transaction volume. We have revenue and cost share models. We have data volume, user-centric. And each one of these can be applicable for different businesses. So for example, when we talk about transaction volume, we see this a lot within telecommunication APIs, analytics APIs. We're literally charging by number of events, maybe it's number of API calls, number of text messages. But in the second row here, we have what we call a revenue and cost share. And this is a lot of times a percentage of revenue. It could be a percentage of cost, such as if you're a payments API or a credit card API. We see data volume popular within infrastructure and developer tools where you're charging by number of gigabytes sent, maybe it's number of minutes processed, if you're a communications platform. We also see a lot of user-centric metrics. And this we see usually with customer-facing tools like a CRM or analytics tool that might be customer-facing. And lastly, we have what we call resource metrics. And we see this a lot within AWS, Azure, and other cloud vendors. We might be charging on compute units, active hours, or something else. Notice for every single one of these metrics, it's aligned to what the customer is getting out of the API. Now, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're building out an email API. And within that email API, there's two different ways to meter. Option one would be to meter based off of the number of email templates stored in the platform. One person could have one email template, another customer could have thousands of email templates. Now, there's an issue with this pricing model. If you think about a customer value, why are they actually purchasing this email API? They're probably trying to generate either leads, reach out to customers. They're trying to do something. They're trying to figure out that email outreach. And if a customer creates thousands of email templates, but they never ever send a single email through the API, they got zero value. They never reached a single customer. They never were able to generate leads. They just stored a bunch of stuff. So a better metric to charge on would be maybe number of emails sent or number of distinct contacts reached. Because in that case, you're aligned to what the customer is trying to get out of the API, which is trying to reach customers or leads or something along those lines. Let's talk about billing strategy for a second. And this we've seen popularized with different cell phone bills where you have a prepaid model and a postpaid model. On the prepaid side, customers purchasing credits or they're purchasing quota ahead of time, and then they're later consumed. When we look at a postpaid model, the customer only pays for the usage after the service is already consumed. So this is after they're already using the API for a bit. When you look at prepaid, there's a lot of advantages for the business. Number one is better cash flow because you're getting that payment up front. So this can help, especially if you're just starting out or if you're thinking about cash flow from a business standpoint. is also more familiar with traditional enterprise software. So traditionally, when you buy a multi-year agreement, this is something very similar. However, there's a huge con here, which is the friction that can be introduced with onboarding. Because now you're asking for a customer to pay up front before they saw any value from the API itself. It can also be a lot harder when you're trying to implement pay-as-you-go, because you don't even know what the usage is. You're asking a customer to commit to something before they even know what their volume and what their requirements will be. A lot of times it requires some measurement, some piloting to understand what that volume might look like at the end of the day. So that's where we get into postpaid billing. We can actually allow the customer to start testing out the API just by putting down a credit card or getting them to start adopting it without even knowing what that volume is. So it can make pay-as-you-go much, much easier, because now they're not trying to calculate what the volume should be. But there are some downside risk here. There could be additional credit risk by the company. It can be abused, especially if the cost to service that API is extremely high. This can happen if you have expensive vendors or other services that you depend on to make that API happen. Let's talk about packaging strategy for a second. In this case, we've seen two popular and different ways to package your API tiers. So on the left here, we have our traditional SaaS tiers. We have your good, better, and best plan. And folks will gradually migrate and upgrade to the next plan. And the nice benefit here is it can enforce a minimum spend. You can actually have a menu, or you can have a pre-packaged menu, so you don't have to force the customer to think about what do they need. You just actually allow the customer to self-select. I am a startup. I need this plan. I'm an enterprise customer. I need this plan, without having a lot of different variables to play with. It's a lot more predictable for the customer. They get their expected bill each month. They know exactly what they're going to spend. But there's a huge con, which is there's friction in expansion. And the reason being is, consider you have a $100 a month plan and a $500 a month plan. Customer signs up and they expect $200 in value from this API, and it costs $100 for them. So of course they're going to sign up for the $100 a month plan. However, they're still only getting $200 in value. So that means that delta is $100. That means you're actually negative when they start looking at the $500 a month plan. So you need to get them to go above $500 before they're ready to upgrade to that next tier. So you have this stair-step function, which might not necessarily be aligned to what a customer is seeing. So when you look at pay-as-you-go, which is the other option, it can be a lot more efficient for the customer, right? They only need to pay for what they need. And so that perceived value versus what they're paying for, it's always aligned, and it's always almost one-on-one. So it can appear cheaper for the customer. However, there is a big con for pay-as-you-go billing. And you can actually upset your customers, especially with billing surprises. No one wants to put down their credit card expecting it was $1 for the service, and then a month later, suddenly they get a $10,000 bill, and they have to go explain that to their manager. Why is this API costing $10,000? It can be also a lot more complex to implement, because now you need a metering strategy. You need to figure out what to actually bill on. You can't just have this, fixed tier price for folks. The last thing I want to talk about around the business model itself is invoicing strategy. And there's two popular mechanisms we've seen here. And this is mostly a finance concern rather than a product concern. Recurring is a popular scheme we've seen, especially with SaaS tools. It's much easier for the finance team to recognize that revenue. You don't have to track exactly which period that the consumption happened. It's more predictable for your customers. They know exactly when they're going to get that invoice. It's once a month, it's once a year, it's once a quarter. It's easier for their procurement and finance team to also deal with it. However, it can have bad unit economics, especially for low-cost SaaS. Think about a situation where, or maybe it's just 10 cents or $1 a card transaction for $1 worth of consumption. Increase the overhead of handling those tiny transactions. Harder, where now you have the the economics itself of the credit card fees and everything else. And that's where we see the threshold-based model work really well. This is popularized by the ad tech market, where you're not charged until a certain threshold is reached. For example, $500, maybe it's $5,000. It doesn't matter if it's this month or that month, it might carry over. Those credits might carry over. And so the nice thing there is you're actually reducing the transaction costs because you're able to bulk or batch all those transactions into one big bulk request. So instead of having a bunch of tiny dollar transactions, you have one big $500 or $1,000 or whatever that threshold is. And so it can make prepaid much easier as well, especially if you're doing pay-as-you-go, because now if you look at Twilio's model, for example, you're able to just commit to $500 worth of credits. You're not worried about spending those or using that consumption in a month because those credits can carry over. And then once they draw down and you get to a certain balance, you can just re-up your credits. So it's a popular model to do prepaid with pay-as-you-go when you do this threshold strategy. The biggest con is it is harder for finance to recognize the revenue because if you buy credits in, say, January, but those credits are consumed in January and partway through February, now you need to handle that revenue recognition. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how do you actually figure out the right KPIs and metrics for API products. There's a ton of different infrastructure metrics out there. There's things like uptime SOAs, performance SOAs, error rates, requests per minute, but none of these metrics are necessarily aligned to the product and business goals. So that's an important thing when you start defining the KPIs for your API products. And so as a product owner and product manager, you should focus on one of these three areas. There's adoption, engagement, and retention. And sometimes you might be focusing on all three. Maybe it's two for the quarter. It depends on what the business needs are, but it's trying to align those different KPIs to one of these three buckets. So let's talk about adoption. So one of the biggest things to look at is how long does it take for a developer to get to the first hello world? What that means is how long does it take for them to sign up and make that very first API call? Whether it's through Postman, it could be a tool like Curl, it doesn't matter. They're not necessarily to full production yet. It's not a high volume, but they're at least putting the effort into experimenting with your API, looking at your documentation, and making that first API call. And so this is a funnel that I'm displaying here, which has 3 steps. The first step is sign up, which means they sign up on our website. The second step is that first hello world. Talk about that very first API call. But the issue with that step there, they're not necessarily generating revenue or value through the API yet. They're just experimenting. They're just playing around with the docs. And that's where we get to this third step, which is your first working app. And that might mean they meet some certain threshold or criteria before that value is really received. So in this case, I'm showing that in the third step at the top right there, they made over 100 payment transactions. Now this is going to be dependent on your business. So for example, if you're a telco API, it may mean sending over 100 text messages. If you're an analytics API, it may mean ingesting over 1 million events over a course of a month. It really depends on the business, but it's important to define what is the value that a customer is truly getting. It's a lot more just making a single API call. And so there's 2 things you can measure. The first is conversion rate itself. How many folks get to that first hello world? How many folks get to that time to working app? And the other thing to measure is how long does it take? Because this is a great way to measure end-to-end developer experience. Are there issues with your onboarding flow? Are there issues with your documentation? Is there issues with how customer success engages with customers? So both of these metrics can measure the end-to-end developer experience and initial activation flow. But now let's talk about engagement. So going back to what I mentioned around figuring out the right metrics to meter on and bill on, the same thing matters for engagement itself, right? So engagement means, how do people get value out of this API? Now, the tricky thing for API businesses, they're not logging into a web portal every day, so you can't just necessarily measure how many active users I have using my website or portal. I don't remember the last time, I logged into Twilio's website, but I'm still getting value out of the API itself. And so again, this is aligned to different businesses. So if you're an e-commerce platform, and you have different stores using your e-commerce platform, you might look at things like checkout conversion rate, or how many different platforms have inventory listed in the platform. If you're a SaaS API, you might look at things like uses of different integrations, extensions, how many different customers are using the integrations, what is the breadth and depth of those integrations. For a data API, it might be things like match rate, was it found in the database, were they able to get the results that the customer was looking for? And lastly, if you're a logistics API, a good engagement metric might be, how many successful orders were placed and fulfilled, what was the time and cost to fulfill that order. These are the business metrics that your customers are going to care about. Again, not things like requests per minute. They don't care how many servers you have or how much memory you have for your infrastructure, even though that stuff still matters. The last but not least is retention itself. And in this case, we're trying to grow long-term customers to make sure, are they still getting value out of the platform? And this here, I'm plotting two different customer segments. We have an enterprise segment and a self-service segment. And what we're looking for is, does the retention curve flat? And now, sometimes folks will call this a smile curve. And on the left here, you'll see it always starts at 100%. Because everyone will be active with the API the very first week they sign up and start getting integrated. But you notice each week thereafter, it starts decreasing. So in week 1, we see for the enterprise segment, only 75% of that segment is still active, is still using the API. Self-service is even lower, which is not surprising. Now, a lot of times with self-service, you're going to see a larger drop-off given the process for self-service versus enterprise. And so we see only 38% of that segment is still active. However, we also see that was the largest drop-off in week 1. When we go to week 2, it's roughly similar. In fact, for self-service, it jumps to 40%. And for enterprise, it goes from 75% to 66%. And it tapers off. And so by the time we get to week 9, we see that enterprise is still at 81% and self-service is 31%. So this is what I would call a good retention curve. What is a bad retention curve? Is when it continues to go down to 0. And by the time you get to week 9, you don't have any customers still sticking with the platform. That means you might not want to keep focusing on adoption if there's a problem with the product itself. It's not sticky enough for customers. Last but not least, let's talk about how to actually grow the API product. And this is actually one of the hardest things. And the reason being is selling to developers is hard. Today, developers have a lot more autonomy and authority than they had 10, 20 years ago. Also, developers, a lot of times they don't want to talk to sales and marketing. They want to explore an API product on their own terms, on their own time. Maybe it's 2 a.m. If that's what it takes, that's what it takes. And also, buying is a lot more decentralized than before. It's no longer a planned rollout by the C-suite. An individual developer can, explore a tool, sign up, and then, ask the manager and put on their credit card and get it rolled out to production in just a couple of weeks. They don't need to have this planned rollout strategy anymore. And more importantly, number 5, which is developers can build it themselves. So trying to convince a developer saying, hey, you can't do this, you need to buy the software, that's not going to work when you try to sell to a technical audience. And so sales, they're actually focused mostly on high ROI opportunities, right? They're actually focused on customers after already seeing value before sales engages. So these are folks who already signed up, they're testing out your API, they got to that hello world, and they're growing their usage. And by the time they're growing their usage, they know everything about the API, the value that's seen. And so sales is more about a consultative, how do we help you get this deployed? How do we help you get more value out of what you built already? And so the biggest issue here is developers need a lot of buy-in from different stakeholders. There's legal and security review, compliance risk, a lot of different priorities and shifting priorities. And also there's finance procurement, a lot of different things that are outside of the developer's control. So how do you make sure you can make your API as self-service as possible and drive adoption without all these issues that are big obstacles? Well, you make it self-service. right? And so instead of dealing with legal and security, have a simple click-through terms of service. Instead of dealing with product priorities and ever-changing delays, have a very fast integration process. Have an SDK or plugin or whatever it is that takes 10 or 15 minutes to set up. Make it dead simple and stupid to set up so they don't have to worry about, oh, I got to invest a week into this POC. And instead of dealing with finance and procurement, that's where just leveraging the manager's credit card could be super valuable. And this goes back to why is all this usage-based billing and metering so important, because it allows someone to get started super quick with your API and then deal with all the procurement stuff at a later point when they already see value, when they already built something that they can show to their manager, they can show to their customers, show to their partners. People are already getting something out of it. And then really for sales, it's just a matter of selling through these developers. And these are things around increasing usage, more complex enterprise requirements, things like single sign-on, maybe it's particular integrations. It could be additional teams or use cases that they can go after. But again, sales, it's really a consultative approach versus, hey, let's do a demo and get you on a large contract immediately. The last thing I do want to chat on, which is the pitfalls of self-service. Account management can be extremely hard to make scalable. There's going to be issues during onboarding. People are going to have questions around your API and your documentation. There's going to be changing business needs. So for example, you go from a couple folks using the API to now hundreds or maybe even thousands of folks. There's going to be billing surprises. There's going to be a lot of things that they still need to do, even if the API is already deployed. And so one of the best ways to do that is make everything self-service as much as possible. Everything from quota management to getting visibility into how the usage is trending, to things like changing the plan, changing commitment levels, make everything as much as possible self-service. That way, you don't have your CSM support team dealing with mundane tasks. They can actually focus on working with customers to get them successful with the API itself. Same thing with billing surprises. Let them know, hey, you're about to exceed your subscription quota, or we've seen a higher than usual amount of traffic. Send them that email. Be transparent. This can go a long way to avoiding billing surprises and having that tough discussion when a developer sees that $10,000 bill and doesn't know what to do. Lastly, there's going to be a time when you have to figure out, do you iterate or deprecate? And this is for any product lifecycle, and APIs are no different. And hopefully you can iterate, and that's where the KPIs and metrics and other things are important, so you can measure and figure out what are customers doing in terms of depth and breadth of usage of the API. But sometimes you do have to deprecate. And the important thing here is don't break their stuff. If you're going to deprecate something, make sure you over-communicate. Let them know whether it's through email, through in-app pop-ups. Some folks will add a HTTP header. So actually we'll say this endpoint is deprecated as soon as they hit it, because not everyone is checking their email these days, but at least when they're playing around with the API, they can see literally in Postman, oh, this is a deprecated API. Thanks. My email is here, derric@moesif.com. Let me know if you have any questions on analytics and API monetization, and always happy to help.